the bodies continue to pile up in Southern California. The madness has not ended.
I didn't actually feel I was getting the job done because we were having so many of them, and just when they thought they'd have something, another body would show up.
And we're going back and looking at the chart, we're saying, wait a minute, there might be a third guy here, because that MO was even a little bit different. This guy was picking up Marines. It's like a trilogy of terror with these three guys.
He was the most sadistic out of all of them. He really liked to torture these people while they were alive.
He came up with new and imaginative ways of inflicting pain.
Total psychopath, way beyond being any kind of a sociopath.
Police are confounded. There seems to be very little that connects these young men. They didn't know one another. They weren't even from the same cities or towns.
He was a hunter. People would hitchhike, and if he's willing to stop and give him a ride, that was not something unusual back then either. A lot of times it was the drive to their death.
Orange County investigators are dealing with a possible mass murderer and a list of victims that continues to get longer.
The most recent victim, however, is Jeffrey Nelson of Buena Park. The 18-year-old's body was thrown from a moving car onto the Garden Grove Freeway last Saturday morning.
In 1977, Carney is in prison. 1980, they've got William Bonin, but the bodies continue to pile up in Southern California. The madness has not ended.
Once Bonin was convicted, it was a big relief to us. But there were still cases, there were still bodies being dropped. And we're going back and looking at the chart, we're saying, wait a minute, there might be a third guy here, because that MO was even a little bit different. This guy was picking up Marines, hitchhiking. And there was one case where he had thrown a Marine out of the car, out of a rolling vehicle. We were aware of these. They were still contacting us about any young boy who was murdered anywhere near California. It's like a trilogy of terror with these three guys.
There was a series of bodies found with what could be considered anti-gay treatment of the bodies after death. There were 5 or 6 of them with foreign objects inserted into them, disgusting, graphic behavior with dead bodies.
They are mutilated, much more so than what we saw with Carney or with Bonin, and it doesn't stop. It continues more and more and more.
The homicide victims were brutalized, and that's like an understatement. There were beheadings, there were ligature marks, torturing, there was sodomized. There were victims that had tree branches that were rammed up inside of the victims. All kinds of evidence that these people had been, in many cases, slowly and agonizingly mutilated before they were murdered and brutalized further after the fact. After Daniel Moore was a Marine, And that's significant with this killer because Marines were his favorite prey. He used to troll places like Camp Pendleton, the El Toro Marine Air Base. He knew that a good many of them were young, not well versed in the ways of the world, and looking to get drunk and forget about basic training. They almost uniformly had no transportation because they were literally fresh off the farm without a driver's license or a car, and they wanted to go out and have a good time. He would go to the main gates of these various military bases and pick up hitchhikers who wanted to go into town, get a drink, see a girl. Moore was the first of many.
What you find out as you look at the details about how they died, it's the most horrendous thing a detective could ever experience in a long career. Nothing can match the sickening descriptions.
He was probably the most sadistic out of all of them. He really liked to torture these people while they were alive, cut off their genitals, sometimes biting their genitals off, taking the cigarette lighter from a car and burning their eyeballs with it, mutilating them, cutting them, and then he would be driving down the highway and just toss their body out of the car. He just looked at these people as pieces of meat, and then once he was done, he would discard them like trash.
He came up with new and imaginative ways of inflicting pain, jamming things up people's rectums and scoring their scrotums and splitting their penises, and just the most horrible, awful, despicable things that one human being can do to another.
Total psychopath, way beyond being any kind of a sociopath. He didn't care about anything except his own desires and torturing people. He got off torturing, horribly torturing these kids.
He was a hunter, and a lot of times his victims were victims of circumstance. Sometimes there were accounts that he befriended these individuals in some of the local establishments, spent some time with them, and then convinced them to drive. People would hitchhike, and if he's willing to stop and give them a ride, that was not something unusual back then either. A lot of times it was the drive to their death.
Keith Crotwell was there in the parking lot at Ripples. Ripples was a up-and-coming gay disco, I guess you would call it. It was much more than a bar, but Crotwell went there with a couple of his friends to see if they could pick up girls. And then this guy shows up after he's been circling the parking lot for a while, who had a mustache, had deep, dark eyes that seemed to look right through you, and says, "You guys need some brews." And of course they thought that was a great idea, so he had them hop in his car and then took them for a ride and served up beer that he already had in the cooler in his back seat. Seemed very convenient, but they were young and dumb, and they didn't pay any attention to any of the danger signals. So they took the beers and they drank them. One of them, after the fact, described to me how he got deposited out of the car like he was too small a fish being chucked out by the fisherman who had a bigger fish that he was going to fry. His two buddies, they woke up with hangovers, and somehow they got home. But when they tried to get in touch with Crotwell, he wasn't home. Nobody knew where he was, and his parents started to think that he had run away. Some time later, A father and his boy were out on one of the jetties at the Long Beach Marina, and they came across a rotting human skull. The police showed up. They bagged the skull and did some testing and matched it to a headless body that had been found off of a freeway many miles away from Long Beach in Orange County. Turned out it was Keith Crotwell, and at least the mystery of his disappearance was solved, but how his head was separated from his body went unsolved for quite a while.
They were dropping cases on us left and right. I mean, it was unbelievable that the burden that we had, and the serial killers were just continuing.
Early on, there was a lot of crossover because obviously they hadn't identified Bonin or Kearney. They just knew that they had a bunch of victims. And then within those victim profiles, there were certain differences among those victims, primarily in the way they were killed. One of the big things that they focused on was the alcohol and diazepam overdose. There was also things about victims being emasculated and also victims being dumped on the side of freeways.
Whoever was doing that, the suspicion was they had been exposed to some military training. A couple of techniques that were used of putting paper in the nostrils, that would be done to keep liquids from expelling out of the nostrils after death when you're hauling the body away to dump it. It doesn't mess up your car or your van. Another thing, using a sock, stuffing it into the rectum in order to prevent the corpse from expelling fluids that way. And that was an important clue that they had to go on.
I didn't actually feel I was getting the job done because we were having so many of them. And I think everybody involved realized that we had 6 investigators working on this thing 16 hours a day. And just when they thought they'd have something, another body would show up.
Mark Hall went out partying on New Year's with his friends. Everybody got drunk, and everybody half remembered what happened. The bottom line was the next day, Mark Hall was among the missing, and the friends had no idea what happened to him. Only several days later did they learn that he had been murdered, and his horribly mutilated body was left in a relatively remote part of southern Orange County.
Police are confounded by this because there seems to be very little that connects these young men. They didn't know one another. They weren't even from the same cities or towns. And what was the link? What was the factor, the X factor that would make it possible to find out who was doing this?
Nobody knew where to turn. The CHP, California Highway Patrol, they were patrolling the 5 freeway down by Mission Viejo in Orange County. And there was a sergeant and his officer in a car because there wasn't much happening. It was kind of a slow night. And they see this car weaving. It's starting to weave from lane to lane. What's going on? Well, it could be a DUI.
He was driving a little bit slower than the posted speed limit. He was weaving in and out of his lanes. He was kind of driving on the right shoulder, so they thought that this individual was intoxicated. So they initiated a traffic stop. Initially, he did not stop. He kept driving. They shined the light in the back of the car. They can see the driver moving around inside the vehicle, which again raises the officer's suspicions. But he eventually pulls over to the right shoulder and stops. Once he stops, he gets out of the car and comes back and approaches the officers on foot. Based on my experience, that again is also suspicious because one of two things. Most people don't approach officers at a stop. And number two, the way my brain works is there's something in the car that he doesn't want me to see. So he's distracting my attention away from the car. These two officers do their DUI investigation.
He takes him to the side of the highway and he's saying, wait, have you been drinking? I only had 2 drinks, we want to check you out and see. They give him the field sobriety test. He's not passing it. He's having difficulty. He's slurring his speech. He's stumbling. He can't do finger to nose.
They make the determination that the driver is under the influence of an intoxicating substance. They place him under arrest and put him in the backseat of their patrol car. The passenger officer goes up to check on the car. They notice an individual sitting on the passenger seat of that car. Initially, the officer thinks that he's either passed out or asleep. He tries to rouse him to see what his story is. Perhaps he can, drive the car away, but that passenger is unresponsive.
So one of the 2 officers went over to the passenger side, opened the door, and the fellow fell over.
The officer steps in there and kind of shakes the guy. The guy doesn't move. And then he takes a pulse. It's cold. And then all of a sudden, he opens the door, and there it is. The guy is exposed, his genitals showing.
His hands are secured behind him, and he looks a little closer, and it looks to be some ligature marks around his neck.
They were his shoelaces that had been tied around his wrists, and that he'd probably been strangled with a belt. He was a tall fellow, and turned out that he was a Marine who had been stationed at nearby Camp Pendleton in southern Orange County. They called EMTs, and they showed up and transported the victim to the nearest hospital. But they determined that he was pretty much dead on arrival.
This was just supposed to be a DUI stop, an easy traffic stop. Now they're going to have to call the homicide detectives. There's a dead body in the car.
His story was that he just picked up this individual hitchhiking on the side of the road, and perhaps he had some sort of medical emergency. Perhaps he ingested some sort of substance that led to his death.
The driver of the car was arrested for suspected homicide.
That is not the end of the story. They identified the driver through his California identification, and at the time, he had a limited criminal history. He had some arrests for solicitation in Long Beach.
The driver turned out to be a computer repairman named Randy Stephen Kraft.
They called the homicide detectives because there was a dead body there, and eventually they searched the car. When they went into the trunk, they found a piece of paper, and it had all these names abbreviated. And they went down. The first one was stable. Turned out that was where Randy Kraft would pick it up. That was one of the gay bars. And you go down, it would say the name of where the person was picked up or some characteristic of that person all the way down. But it talked about other places like Portland, Oregon. It talked about Michigan.
One thing leads to another, and they think that Kraft might have been responsible for like 67 murders.
Randy Kraft was born 1945, grew up in Southern California. His parents had moved out here at the beginning of World War II to work in the defense industry, his father for an aircraft maker.
He had 3 older sisters who were substantially older than him. He was doted upon because he was the only boy in the family. And all 3 of his sisters and his mother treated him with deference. He was the little prince. But there was this dark aspect of his early upbringing. His father liked to drink, and he would have this personality change and go into rages at times. There are a couple of bits of evidence when Randy was a baby. He supposedly fell down the stairs and broke his collarbone when he was a toddler. Breaking a baby's collarbone with a fall is pretty damn difficult. I mean, babies don't just fall and break a bone the way that an altar cocker like myself does. Their bones are elastic. So the fact that he would have a broken collarbone cast suspicion on him right off the bat. And then there was a second incident when he again suffered a fall and passed out and had to be taken to a health clinic nearby. Both of these are incidents when he was a baby, and the obvious culprit would be his father. I haven't been able to ever get anyone to confirm that. The closest that any of the 3 sisters came to saying it was the middle sister, Doris, who told me that, yeah, Dad could really put him away, and when he did, he was completely unpredictable.
Randy grew up in the 1950s, identified as a conservative, a Republican, as a young man, had said, I want someday to be in politics, perhaps a U.S. senator. That's what he was thinking in the 50s. In 1964, he was involved in politics as a 19-year-old. He actually helped campaign as a volunteer for the Republican presidential nominee, Senator Barry Goldwater. But then, as he got a little older, his political views started changing. He no longer reflected his parents' views. He went off to college, Claremont College, where he joined the ROTC, and he became a little bit, if you will, more progressive or more liberal, adopting political views and cultural views that were more common among college students in the 1960s. He joined the U.S. Air Force and was assigned to Edwards Air Force Base, which is just north of Los Angeles County. He painted aircraft, supervised later, became an airman first class. So he had a good Air Force career going. Kraft had hinted to his parents that he was gay. He would bring his male friends over to the house to meet them, but they didn't quite seem to pick up on it until finally he came out and said, I'm gay. His father didn't take it very well. His mother, somewhat more understanding. It's also a confession, if you will, that he made to the military, to a supervisor at Edwards Air Force Base. If in the 60s or the 70s, the military found out, especially you telling them that you are gay, they would kick you out. They didn't want you. So they initiated a general discharge for him for medical reasons, almost as if Kraft had lost a leg or something, that he wasn't fit, not needed in the military anymore. And that ended his military career. Kraft returns home to his parents' house and starts doing a variety of jobs, including bartending, working at gay bars, working for a swimwear company, working for a water company. He goes back to school and brushes up his education resume, studying education.
He was an aspiring computer programmer, which, given the early 80s, was an up-and-coming field. He worked for a couple different companies and then worked as an independent contractor as well to do computer programming for these institutions. He was living a homosexual lifestyle in Long Beach. He had a significant other that he lived with in Long Beach. They had an on-again, off-again relationship.
But there was a dark side to what Kraft was doing in his years after the military. He was cruising the roads of Southern California, going to gay bars, picking up young men, drugging them with drugs and alcohol, sodomizing and killing them.
Now, Randy Kraft's victims were older, like I say, they were Marines. So they were a little bit harder to control, but he was using drugs and stuff of that nature to knock them out and then strangle them and then kill them.
Kraft began experimenting with pharmaceuticals early on, as early as his college days, on his own girlfriend at the time, because he did have a girlfriend at one time. And then later on, his so-called friends. He tried it out on them to see, they were his guinea pigs, to see how they would react. Over time, he kind of perfected it. Kraft was genuinely a classic sadist. He had to keep his victims alive, and he learned over time how to dose them so that he could keep them alive, but under his control, literally for days.
That's what we were dealing with back in the day. It was surreal.
There was one Marine victim who he took a lot of pictures of, Polaroid shots, who probably had been alive for the better part of the week. And he, he just kept dosing him with exactly the right amount of medication because he wanted to, hear the screams, I guess. Kraft was a monster. One who survived Kraft was a biker named Joey Fancer, one of Kraft's earliest would-be victims. He was a 12 or 13-year-old skateboarder in Huntington Beach. He cut class on a regular basis, and he'd go down to the pier in Huntington Beach, and he met this guy. He talked a good line and lured Fancher to his hotel room, I guess, on the promise of beer. He gave him something to drink, and the next thing Fancher knew, he awakened in his bed, his pants were down, and he was exposed. There was nobody there, but it was getting dark, and obviously he'd been out for several hours. He got up and got the hell out of there and went home. The police did investigate. They did find all these prescription drugs in his possession, but they never did anything about it. He wasn't charged, and Fancher got his first taste of Southern California justice by doing the right thing and telling his parents, then seeing nothing happen as a direct result of his shining a light on this pervert. Crotwell was the case wherein ultimately two of Long Beach's finest had enough circumstantial evidence in terms of Kraft having been spotted in the vicinity of the body, not the head, but the body. He'd been seen leaving the parking lot at Ripple's in his car that evening. It ultimately brought two homicide detectives to his front door, and they wanted him to come down to headquarters and submit to questioning. And Kraft did so. He went to the Long Beach Police Department, went into the classic little interrogation room with these two cops who were recording the whole thing. He managed, over the period of an hour or so, to dance around most of their pointed questions and point out that he had car trouble and he needed help from his roommate, and he walked away from his car to because it had gotten stuck into the sand, and that was all just coincidental that he happened to be around when whoever it was that killed this poor unfortunate had left the body just a few yards away. You would think that the cops would follow up on that, but there's no evidence that the cops did anything further on that. They just made the judgment call that, yeah, he was this friendly computer techie and he just happened to be in the proximity of this freeway killer victim. It was yet another example of Randy Kraft literally getting away with murder.
One of the things that highlighted Randy Kraft was he was known as the scorecard killer. And during his search of that Toyota after his arrest, they found what they believed to be an encrypted list of potential victims.
The scorecard, which was a sheet of notebook paper that looked like it might have been bloodstained. Some of them were relatively obvious, like Edward Daniel Moore, because it was EDM. That was easy for law enforcement to connect to a body. Crotwell was equated with the term parking lot. They were memory triggers to relive the experience of each murder.
Kraft took impeccable notes. It was almost like a highway of what he did.
But you go down that list, and there are a lot of entries that are easily connected to murder victims, but there are a good many that remain anybody's guess to this day.
In 2016, I was assigned to the Orange County Cold Case Homicide Task Force, which at that time was an entity that was run by the District Attorney's Office. And it was a multi-agency entity that worked primarily on solving cold cases. One of the individuals on that list was a John Doe for our agency from 1974. The thing about that individual is that his naked body was tossed off a fire break, which would have been rural southern Orange County back in 1974, and that there were tire tracks along the side of this fire break. And by all indications, it looked like this person had been dumped off the freeway. However, at that time in 1974, his death was ruled accidental due to alcohol and diazepam intoxication. It had only been 5 or 6 days, so unfortunately it was difficult to determine whether he had been strangled or not, just based on the condition of the, for lack of a better term, the flesh, but they were still able to do toxicological examination. So fast forward to 1983, and all these bodies are coming through Orange County and jurisdictions with that same characteristic. They reopened that investigation to say, hey, this victim may be a victim of Randy Kraft. My work in that detail, I learned how to do investigative genetic genealogy, which is using familial DNA to identify these individuals. So in late 2022, we submitted a forensic specimen for this 1974 John Doe to a private lab to do DNA processing in hopes of getting him identified. And over the course of the next 10 months, we successfully identified him as Michael Slick. His mom was still alive, so we went out and interviewed mom and a sister, and the last they had ever heard from Michael was he was hitchhiking to California from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And coincidentally, on Kraft's scorecard is an entry for Iowa.
Meanwhile, they impound the car, they find all sorts of forensic evidence within the car.
And it was a short time after that that they started putting together all the evidence against this guy. And they found literally a drawer full of pictures of men looking like they were asleep in an apartment somewhere. And they were all dead. He had photographed them after he had drugged them and killed them. He would dismember bodies. They found jars of testicles for him and the pictures.
They realize he is the last of the freeway killers.
After some 350 personal interviews with people who knew Randy Kraft and several searches of Kraft's car and Long Beach residence, Orange County Sheriff Brad Gates says he now has a wealth of information on the man accused in the strangulation deaths of 6 young men and now a suspect in at least 10 more murders. Kraft has already been accused of killing Jeffrey Nelson, Wyatt Loggins, Roger Duvall Jr., Mark Hall, Terry Gambrell, and Eric Church. Then there's 25-year-old Michael Lane. His picture was found at Kraft's residence, but it's unknown if he's alive or dead. The same for these men, all believed to be Marines.
Meantime, Randy Kraft, who remains in jail without bail, is awaiting his preliminary hearing. That's scheduled to start here in Orange County on Monday.
The trial, which at the time was deemed to have been the longest in Orange County history, went on for weeks and weeks. He never for a second let down the notion that he'd ever engaged in any sort of mischief. He was an upstanding citizen. He's purported to have viewed all of this as being a persecution because he was gay, even though the evidence is more than overwhelming.
In court, he seemed like he was bored with the whole thing.
Cuts, severs off Jeffrey's testicles and his penis. And when he's through with Jeffrey's body, he discards it out of his car.
Kraft had his excuses. It came out later, after the investigation and during the trial, that Kraft broke away from his family long enough to go out, find Mark Hall, maim him, drug him, kill him, and leave his body up in the hills overlooking Lake Elsinore. He maintained that he was with his family for New Year's, that they watched the Rose Parade together, and I mean, there was a chunk of time in the middle of the night when he was missing, but no one seemed to pay much attention to it. Randy was weird that way. He would wander off and show up later, fresh as a daisy, and his family suspected nothing, ever.
"16 times today, the jury foreman read out the verdict for Randy Kraft.
We want to see justice done. Our son will not be brought back. We have to represent our boy. He can't be here, but we can.
Mrs. Barbara Loggins has waited for nearly 9 years to see the man who killed her son Wyatt convicted. That wait ended late this morning.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Randy Stephen Kraft, guilty of the crime of felony, murder, in the first degree, Robert Wyatt Loggins.
Kraft only sighed when the first guilty verdict was read. 45 minutes later, it was all over.
Each time it was guilty of murder in the first degree.
He is suspected in 21 other murders in California, Oregon, and Michigan. He could get life with no parole or the gas chamber.
His trial, which began in '88, ended in '89 with his sentencing to the gas chamber.
After it was all over, after all 3 freeway killers were prosecuted, we look back on it Why did this happen in Southern California, especially Los Angeles? What made this kind of a magnet that attracted these misfits where they wanted to find young men and have sexual relations with them and kill them?
That is the most interesting thing about these killers, is that they were very good at mimicking being normal, because they had to get these people in their clutches. They had to win them over, to get them in the van, to get them in the car, to get them to come back to their houses. These men were very good at portraying being average, everyday, normal people.
It's just amazing that these 3 serial killers operated at the same time in the same geography. 3 serial killers who were each different, yet had the same motive: to inflict pain and suffering and death for their own pleasures.
These guys, they would talk about murdering people like you and I would talk about where we're going to lunch. That's a sociopath. They have no remorse. They have no feelings or consideration for anybody. It was all about sexual gratification.
But why did it take us so long to catch him? That's always a question an investigator will ask himself, especially afterwards. And especially when you're dealing with youth. You know, it's harder. Those things, and they stay with police officers. The homicide investigators that worked the freeway killer case and everything, they still think about that for a long time afterwards. You don't forget those kind of things.
It was a golden age for serial killers, especially freeway killers. It happened, it was very unfortunate, and many, many, many young lives were lost because of that.
I don't think the world has seen the last serial killer yet. Not sure we ever will.
What happened at the height of these murders, this changed the way a lot of kids lived, because you don't see hitchhikers anymore. I mean, really, if you come around California, you drive anywhere in LA, you don't see people hitchhiking anymore. And the carefree days of that, long gone. And I think Kraft and Bonin had a lot to do with that. It changed everything. It really, really did.
If you add up all of the murders to which they confessed or convicted of, suspected of, it comes to something like 100. What a horrible score to think that for that period of time, these men were able to carry out these crimes as butchers across all of Los Angeles.